This lecture discusses one of the essential parts of the Old Testament or Hebrew Bible known as the Deuteronomistic History. The Hebrew Scriptures are broken down into the Torah, the Nevi'im, and the Ketuvim, which are also known as the Law, Prophets, and the Writings. Today I'll discuss the first part of the Nevi'im, also known as the Former Prophets, and their connection to the book of Deuteronomy. The Deuteronomistic History consists of the books of Joshua through Kings, which are also known as the Former Prophets. Many of the most famous narratives of the Old Testament appear in this collection, including Joshua at the walls of Jericho, David's defeat of Goliath, and Solomon's request for wisdom. These books are often referred to as the Deuteronomistic History because the same editors who worked on Deuteronomy also worked on these books. We'll explore that connection as we consider the fact that the books of Joshua through Kings are also referred to as the Former Prophets. Now, when we think of prophets, we are more likely to think of the latter prophets. The latter prophets feature Isaiah, Jeremiah, and Ezekiel. Although we don't often associate Joshua through Kings with prophets, a number of prophets appear in them, including Samuel, Nathan, and many others, both named and unnamed. One of these unnamed prophets will play a prominent role in prophesying the birth and actions of one of the greatest kings in Judah. The Deuteronomistic history features several key events in the history of Israel. We can date the rise of David as well as the fall of the northern and southern kingdoms. David and Solomon presided over a united kingdom, but the northern kingdom of Israel broke away during the reign of Solomon's son Rehoboam, who only retained the southern kingdom known as Judah. The northern kingdom would be captured by the Assyrians in 722 BCE. Nebuchadnezzar would seize control of the southern kingdom in 587 BCE. In the academic world, we use BC, or before Common Era, rather than BC, before Christ, to describe time in a non-sectarian way. The issue of BC versus BCE is not the only challenge that we face when talking about the history of Israel. We must be aware that modern-day ideas about history cannot easily be applied to the biblical text. The Bible is different because God is clearly recognized as a key agent in the unfolding events. We might then call the Bible sacred history in order to differentiate it from secular history. We also have to ask ourselves when the recording of history actually began. The Greek Herodotus is known as the father of history, and he lived in the 5th century BCE. Since the Deuteronomistic history may have been written before or close to this time, perhaps we have an emerging form for recording events and interpreting them. Previous recollections of the past often consisted of annals that recorded events with details but little analysis. We might best describe the Deuteronomistic history as narrative history that explains the rise and fall of Israel and Judah due to their missteps. Later texts in the Hebrew Scriptures will discuss the hope for the future. We can also refer to the Deuteronomistic history as a national history, featuring key events that show conquest, chaos, disorder, and ultimately disillusion. Many have compared the history of Israel to the history of the United States, since the U.S. was seen as a promised land to many. Plus, much like the divided kingdom of Israel, the U.S. had a civil war of North versus South. Of course, in the Bible, the Northerners are considered to be in the wrong, while the Southerners are doing what is right. Thinking of the Deuteronomistic history as a national history is instructive because we see U.S. history filled with religious ideas, such as portraits of George Washington that attempt to deify him, as well as the mantra, God bless America. Many challenge popular interpretations of American history, wondering if America is truly a melting pot because of slavery. Similarly, some have challenged the interpretations provided by the Deuteronomistic historian. But who was the Deuteronomistic historian? Was it a lone individual or a group? Was there something more going on? German scholar Martin Noth argued that the history was created by a composer living in exile. The exile may have inspired this individual to write in order to preserve the history of the people of Israel and Judah. Perhaps exile was the impetus for writing history. The people needed to know why the mistakes of the past occurred in order to prevent future problems. Frank Moore Cross of Harvard had a different theory. He argued that the Deuteronomistic history featured two different periods of composition and editing. The first occurred during the reign of Josiah. The second agreed with Noth's idea of the work being done in exile. Scholars have continued to debate the origins of the Deuteronomistic history. Most, however, agree that the Deuteronomist was not a lone individual, but rather a group of individuals. As a result, we refer to them as the Deuteronomistic school. The school made use of several sources in composing and editing the history of Israel. One source that is no longer extant is the Book of Jasher, which may potentially be translated the Book of the Upright. The book has the famous story of Joshua commanding the sun and the moon to stand still so that the Israelites would have enough daylight to achieve victory over their enemies. The book of Jasher is also referenced in 2 Samuel 1:18 because the book of Jasher contains the Song of the Bow, which David commanded to be taught to the people in honor of his friend Jonathan. Another source is the book of the Acts of Solomon. We cannot know if this non-extant book was a history or merely a chronicle of events. Chronicles often consist of lists of events, whereas history describes the events in greater detail and potentially offers some analysis of these occurrences. One thing we do know is that history may not only be created because of key events like the exile, history may arise when a centralized government appears. The multiple mentions of the books of the annals of the kings of Judah in the Deuteronomistic history reveals that historical sources or chronicles may be associated with the rise of kings. Kings wanted to make sure that their kingdom was organized, and they wanted to list their mighty acts in order to preserve their legacies. Previous national histories may have consisted of stories passed down from generation to generation, but kingship created the administrative apparatus necessary for recording key events. Kings employed scribes for this purpose. The mention of the book of the annals of the kings of Israel in Joshua through Kings provides evidence that northerners contributed to the Deuteronomistic history. Perhaps these annals were preserved by northern scribes who fled to the south when the Assyrians invaded Israel. In spite of the references to these books, the most important book in the Deuteronomistic history is the book of the Law of Moses. Referenced multiple times in Joshua through Kings, this book was to be the foundation for life in Israel. Joshua 1:8 speaks of the prosperity and success that will result from following its commands. Failure to obey would lead to disastrous consequences such as the exile. According to Joshua 24:26, Joshua wrote in this book and even attempted to preserve it for posterity. He recorded the people's commitment to the covenant and even warned them that they would abandon God and serve false gods. After the death of Joshua, the people served foreign gods in the book of Judges and became subjugated to foreign powers. The book of the Law of Moses was essential for their success, but they no longer followed it. So what is the book of the Law of Moses? Could it be the entire Torah? Does it represent one of the books? An account in 2 Kings 22 may provide potential answers. During the reign of Josiah, who was considered to be one of the greatest kings of Judah, a book was found in the house of the Lord. When Josiah heard the words of the book, he was so troubled that he tore his clothes. His leaders sought the guidance of the prophetess Huldah, a powerful but often forgotten woman of God in the Scriptures. She said that failure to follow the book would result in judgment. However, the wrath of God would be postponed because of Josiah's humility. Because the reforms Josiah instituted are so similar to the commandments found in Deuteronomy, many believe that Deuteronomy is the book of the Law of Moses. If so, we may have located the Deuteronomistic school and offered some credence to Cross's theory of the first redaction being done during the reign of Josiah. Although Josiah was seen as an important figure who would bring Judah back to God, Josiah did not achieve all of his goals. He died on the battlefield when he opposed Pharaoh Necho. Josiah perished at Megiddo, or Mount Megiddo, which is Har Megiddo, aka Armageddon. Josiah's death brought an end to the best hopes for Judah. Like David and Hezekiah, he was one of the good kings. Much of the Deuteronomistic history is built around his story. 1 Kings 13 records a prophet proclaiming that one day a king named Josiah would come to power and restore the true priesthood and tear down false gods and false places of worship. Josiah was born many years later. 2 Kings 23, verses 15 through 18, record that the prophet's tomb stood as a monument against idolatry. Josiah fulfilled the prophecy of the man of God, but those who served the king must have felt great sadness at his death. They may have viewed the loss of his life as the loss of hope. Perhaps Josiah's advisors were part of the Deuteronomistic school. They may have even been refugees who came down from the north carrying annals with them with an impetus to record the history of the downfall of the north in the hope that the south would not repeat its mistakes. Perhaps they became part of Hezekiah's court. They may have attained favor with this good king. The school may have been something of a political party in the courts of the kings of Judah. They were most likely out of favor when Josiah's wicked father Manasseh was ruler. They saw great hope at the birth of Josiah, believing that they could bring back the book of the Law of Moses. Because the northern kings did not follow the book of the law and worshipped at shrines in Dan and Bethel instead of Jerusalem, the Deuteronomistic school declared all northern kings to be evil. The Deuteronomistic history also criticizes the northern kings for continuing the practice of Jeroboam I, who set up shrines in Dan and Bethel. He did it as a political move. He didn't want his people going down to Jerusalem to worship. Plus, he could set up his own priesthood outside of Jerusalem. According to the Deuteronomistic history, this sin eventually led to the dissolution of the northern kingdom. The Assyrians defeated the northern kingdom of Israel in 722 BCE and deported the people to Assyria. The end of the Deuteronomistic history records Judah experiencing a similar fate. Nebuchadnezzar seized Jerusalem in 587 BCE and deported the king and other officials. The Deuteronomistic history ends with King Jehoiachin of Judah being taken out of prison and living in Babylon. Perhaps the Judites could live in captivity. The concluding verses offer at least a small glimmer of hope. The line of David is still alive, even if its king is under house arrest. Although the Deuteronomistic history, at times, seems critical of the monarchy, seemingly to prefer a theocracy when Saul took the throne, the history desires to protect the Davidic line. God promised David that one of his descendants would always sit on the throne. As a result, the Deuteronomistic school saw the northern kings as pretenders to the throne of David. Due to their concern for the Davidic line of kings, they also attempted to preserve the legacy of David. In fact, some scholars have argued that the Deuteronomistic school went too far in its attempts to absolve David of blame. In particular, they point to the murder of Abner by David's general Joab. The text loudly protests that David had no hand in Abner's death. The usually laconic biblical narrator even comments on this incident, noting that all the people knew that David was not involved. Since Joab was David's accomplice in the death of Bathsheba's husband Uriah the Hittite, some scholars believe that the evidence points to David's complicity in this murder. Nevertheless, the Deuteronomistic school does not protect the legacy of David in every possible way. It should be noted that the chronicler omits David's adulterous affair with Bathsheba, while the Deuteronomistic school makes it a key part of the history of David's reign. A reading of the entire story of the life of David reveals that Israel's most celebrated king often lived life on the edge. He found himself fighting for his life on many occasions. In 1 Samuel chapter 20, verse 3, he said, "There is but a step between me and death." Sadly, subsequent generations of people in Israel and Judah lived their lives much like their heroic king. David faced a coup that divided his kingdom. Although he regained complete control, he always had difficulty holding on to the northern tribes. His successor Solomon struggled with idolatry, even though he built the temple. Hezekiah narrowly escaped the Assyrians when the northern kingdom could not. Eventually, many of the Jews found themselves living in Babylon after deportation. But there was hope, because the Davidic line of kings still lived. Perhaps one of them could accomplish what Josiah could not. Deuteronomistic history leaves us with only this glimmer of hope.